Dr. Miles Carter had always felt a little different. He could hear the sound of a person's heartbeat from across the room. The subtle rhythm of their breath, the tiny tremor in their voice, it was more than just perception. It was a kind of awareness, a sixth sense that felt like something between a curse and a blessing. But today, in the swankiest private gala in New York, this sensitivity was about to make him the most famous man in the world. The gala hall buzzed with the hum of luxury and champagne, yet the crowd parted in a near-reverent hush as Dr. Carter walked through the center, his sharp suit cutting through the dim light like a blade. At 35, with a reputation for healing that defied medical science, he was already a legend. But it wasn't just his intellect or his groundbreaking research that made him famous. It was the fact that he could feel people's pain, not just see it on an MRI. Not just read it from symptoms. Feel it. Every tiny, unexplained ache, every throbbing emotional scar hidden beneath a perfect facade. Dr. Carter had become the world's first emotional doctor. He'd learned to control it over the years. How to focus on the pain that mattered, how to ignore the superficial bruises. But even with years of practice, he was never entirely prepared for what happened when he walked into a room full of high-profile celebrities, politicians, and tycoons who carried with them more emotional baggage than 1,000 average people could ever comprehend. Today, though, it wasn't the crowd that was going to get his attention. It was a man standing near the grand piano, leaning slightly to the left, his hand massaging his temple as though it might somehow stop the pounding in his head. His name was Gregory Wainwright, a billionaire tech mogul who made his fortune by inventing gadgets that people didn't need but swore they couldn't live without. Today, he looked like a man who could no longer live with himself. Dr. Carter, a voice broke through his thoughts. One of the event organizers, a woman in a sleek black dress, approached him with wide, pleading eyes. Mr. Wainwright is having a, well, we don't know what to call it. A migraine, maybe? He insists you're the only one who can help. Carter's lips curled into a half-smile, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He knew what was coming. It always started this way. The problem wasn't that Mr. Wainwright had a migraine, it was that Carter could feel the cause of it. Before the woman could say another word, Carter approached Wainwright, his senses flaring. The moment he was within 3 feet of the billionaire, a strange heaviness settled over him. He could feel the tension in Wainwright's body, the way his stomach was twisted in knots, the erratic pulse beneath the man's wrist. And beneath all of that, there was a deep, gnawing fear, buried beneath layers of material success and bravado. Carter reached out, placing his hand gently on Wainwright's arm. "Mr. Wainwright, tell me what's happening," he said, his voice calm, unhurried. The billionaire winced but nodded. "It's this damn headache," he muttered, eyes squinting. "I've tried everything. I've been to the best specialists, and no one knows what's wrong. Pills don't work. Nothing works." Carter could feel the words vibrating in the air before they even left Wainwright's lips: pain, regret. It was more than just the physical pain of a headache. It was a deep, emotional anguish that felt like a chasm inside the man's chest. As if the weight of the world were pressing down on him, and this headache was only a surface symptom of a much darker, unresolved issue. "I can help," Carter said simply. Wainwright looked at him, skepticism flickering in his eyes. But then, in that moment, Carter reached into his mind and began to focus. He closed his eyes, allowing himself to sense the threads of emotional pain wrapped around Wainwright's mind, as though the man had been living his entire life wearing a cloak made of sorrow. Slowly, Carter let himself drift into that mental space. What he found wasn't just a man in physical pain, it was a man at war with himself. Gregory Wainwright had been carrying the grief of an unspeakable loss for decades, the kind of loss that wasn't visible to the naked eye but had gnawed away at his soul. And there it was, the memory that had triggered the migraine. Abandonment. Carter knew this feeling well. It was a pain he could identify instantly. Wainwright's father, a powerful businessman, had abandoned him as a child. Not in the traditional sense, but in a deeper, more subtle way. His father had never been physically present, leaving young Gregory to fend for himself emotionally. And as an adult, Gregory had spent his entire life seeking validation through wealth, power, and public adoration, all in an effort to replace the love his father never gave him. That emotional ache had solidified into a chronic migraine that no doctor could diagnose. But Carter could sense it as clearly as he could feel his own pulse. "Mr. Wainwright," Carter said softly, "you've been carrying something with you for a very long time." The billionaire's face twitched. "What do you mean?" "You're not sick in the way you think you are," Carter explained, the words flowing effortlessly. "Your body is responding to a grief that's been locked away for decades. You've buried something deep inside you, and it's been eating at you." Wainwright froze. His eyes darted, as if seeking an escape, but there was none. Carter could feel the panic rising in him. "You're not the only one who's been through this," Carter continued. "But I can help you. If you're ready." The room fell silent as Carter made his diagnosis. He had been right before, and the man was desperate enough to trust him now. The billionaire nodded, slowly, unsure but willing. Carter touched his forehead, not with medical tools or artificial intelligence, but with an instinct honed over years of listening to the language of human emotion. It was a language that spoke louder than words ever could. As he did, the world around them seemed to disappear. The headache that had pulsed in Wainwright's temples began to fade, like a fog lifting. But as the physical pain dissipated, Carter felt something else shift. Wainwright was no longer just a man, he was a puzzle. With a quiet sigh, Carter removed his hand. The billionaire blinked, and then slowly, his face softened. For the first time in years, he looked human. "Vulnerable." "I can't believe it," Wainwright said, his voice trembling. "It's gone. You've taken it away." Carter nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. He had healed the symptom. But had he healed the man? Or was this just another form of self-deception? Dr. Carter could feel the weight of the moment press down on him as Wainwright stood there, blinking, stunned, his face softening. The billionaire's stiff posture had relaxed, the lines of strain easing from his features, and for the first time in years, he looked, well, human. Vulnerable. It was a strange thing to see. People didn't expect that from someone like Gregory Wainwright, someone whose empire stretched across continents, whose name was synonymous with cutting-edge technology. A man like him wasn't supposed to have a crack in his armor. But there it was, and Carter could feel it. "I can't believe it," Wainwright whispered, as though still processing what had just happened. "It's gone. You've taken it away." Carter took a step back, feeling the intensity of his own heartbeat for a moment, a sharp contrast to the calmness that now enveloped the room. He didn't speak, just watched as Wainwright stood there, gazing at him with a look that bordered between awe and disbelief. "You were never truly sick," Carter finally said. "This pain, this migraine, it wasn't caused by a physical ailment. It was your mind, your emotions, your past. Your body just didn't know how to deal with it anymore." Wainwright's jaw worked as he processed the words. Carter didn't expect him to understand all at once. Healing wasn't as simple as taking a pill and moving on. No, it was far more complicated than that. And Carter, even with his extraordinary abilities, was beginning to realize the magnitude of what he'd done. What he was doing. The billionaire looked up at him, his expression almost childlike. "I don't know what to say. I've been to the best doctors, the finest specialists. No one knew what was wrong. But you just fixed it. Just like that." Carter didn't answer immediately. He didn't have to. The silence between them spoke louder than anything he could say. He didn't want to be seen as a miracle worker. He wasn't. He wasn't sure what he was anymore. Sometimes, he wondered if he had become something else entirely, something far more dangerous than a healer. "I'll be fine now," Wainwright added, more to himself than anyone else. He turned and walked away, his steps lighter than they had been when he entered. But Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That something had shifted in the man, deeper than the pain that had dissipated. He'd felt it, the subtle change in Wainwright's essence, that slight alteration in his emotional makeup. But it wasn't his place to question the results. Not now, anyway. The room had started to hum with conversation again, but Carter found himself rooted to the spot, his thoughts distant. He stared at his hand, the same hand that had healed Wainwright, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if it had actually healed him. Or if it had just changed him. Was this truly healing? He thought. Or was it something more sinister? It was late when Carter finally returned to his apartment. The city skyline sprawled before him as he sank into his chair. He hadn't planned on staying out so long, but the evening had taken him on a detour he hadn't expected. Wainwright's case had been unusual, yes, but it wasn't the first time Carter had dealt with a patient whose ailments went beyond the physical. The problem was, he hadn't expected to feel what he had felt. Carter closed his eyes, letting the weight of the day settle around him. It was like peeling back the layers of an onion, only to discover there were no ends, just endless layers, each one revealing something deeper, more intimate, more personal. Each time he healed someone, he could feel their pain, feel their past, their regrets, their desires. Sometimes, he could even sense what they needed before they even knew themselves. But Wainwright had been different. There had been an underlying hunger, a desire for validation that hadn't quite been satisfied. He'd healed, yes, but Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something had been altered. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from his assistant, Eva. "There's a new patient. They're asking for you specifically. I've scheduled the appointment for tomorrow morning. You might want to take a look at their file." Carter sighed. The last thing he needed was another appointment. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't just shut it off, the way he had tried to explain to people when they asked how it worked. He wasn't a doctor who simply diagnosed, he was something more. He was the one who felt the pulse of their lives, the one who understood what no one else could. If he didn't help, who would? He stood up and grabbed his jacket. Tomorrow, he thought. I'll deal with tomorrow. The next morning was gray, a heavy fog hanging low over the city. Carter made his way to the office with a sense of apprehension that he couldn't shake. He had been doing this for years, diagnosing, healing, and sometimes even altering people's emotional landscapes, but lately, it felt different. There was something gnawing at him, like a splinter beneath his skin. The more he healed, the more he felt like he was losing pieces of himself. Was he really helping people? Or was he just reshaping them into something they weren't? The office was quiet when he arrived. Eva, always punctual, was already there, looking at the file of his new patient. She handed it to him without saying a word, her expression unreadable. He took the file and flipped it open. Elena Hayes, age 32. Her symptoms were vague, headaches, sleeplessness, and an inability to remember certain parts of her life. But it was the last part that intrigued him, memory loss of traumatic events. Will not acknowledge the loss. Carter raised an eyebrow. This wasn't just some case of amnesia. No, this was something deeper, something more intricate than mere forgetfulness. Do we know anything about her history? He asked Eva. She's a writer. Published a few books. But that's all I could find. She's been to therapists, even a few psychiatrists. No one can seem to crack it. Carter nodded, his mind already spinning. All right. Set her up in room 3. I'll be right in. Elena Hayes sat in the examination room, looking out the window. Her expression was distant, as if she were lost in thought, or maybe she wasn't thinking at all. The moment Carter entered, he noticed the stillness in her, the way her eyes were empty, as though her mind was someplace far away. She didn't acknowledge him at first, and for a moment, he wondered if she even realized he was there. But then, slowly, she turned her head, and their eyes met. Hers were wide, unnaturally so, and Carter immediately felt a coldness sweep through him. This woman was lost, not just physically, but emotionally. Something was severed in her. You're Dr. Carter? She asked, her voice soft and calm, but there was an edge to it. A suspicion, maybe. I've heard about you. He smiled gently, hoping to ease her anxiety. I'm Dr. Carter. I understand you've been experiencing some memory loss. She nodded but didn't speak. Carter could feel her reticence, the wariness. Something wasn't right, and his senses flared. She wasn't just lost in her own mind, she was blocking something. He could feel it, there was something she wasn't telling him. Something deeper. You don't have to tell me everything right away, he said, settling into the chair across from her. But I need to understand what's going on so I can help. She met his gaze again, this time with a flicker of something else, uncertainty, maybe even fear. I don't want your help, she whispered. I don't want to remember. The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of something unsaid, something buried deep. Carter's instincts flared. This wasn't just memory loss. This was a deliberate choice, a choice to forget. And that, he knew, was dangerous. Doctor. Carter's fingers curled around the edge of his chair as Elena's words settled into the space between them. He could feel the tension in the room, the quiet weight of her refusal hanging in the air. She didn't want to remember, and somehow, he knew that wasn't just a personal decision, it was a desperate plea for him to leave whatever pain was locked away untouched. I don't want your help, she repeated, her voice quiet, almost a whisper, as if she were saying it to herself more than to him. Carter studied her. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, but her knuckles were pale, tight, betraying her calm exterior. There was fear there. Fear of something deeper than a forgotten memory. She was afraid of the consequences of remembering. Whatever it was she was hiding, it wasn't just painful, it was something she feared would break her even further. I understand, he said slowly, his voice softer now, trying to bridge the gap between them. But sometimes, what we're afraid of remembering is exactly what we need to heal. You don't have to face it all at once. But if we don't address it, it'll keep you trapped. She didn't respond right away. Her gaze drifted again, this time toward the window. Outside, the city hummed with its usual noise, the rattle of distant traffic, the low murmur of people going about their day. But inside this room, there was only the quiet, crackling tension between them. She was still holding herself back, not just from him, but from the entire world. I can't, she finally said. It's not that I don't want to heal. It's just, some things are better left forgotten. Her eyes flicked back to him, the faintest spark of desperation now creeping into her expression. I erased it. I chose to forget. And now, I don't want it back. I don't want to lose myself in that pain again. Carter didn't speak at first. Instead, he allowed her words to settle, weighing them carefully in his mind. He could feel the layers of her emotions, anxiety, guilt, shame, but under it all, there was something stronger, something buried deeper. The way she spoke, the way her voice faltered, he could sense that this wasn't just a simple case of forgetting. No, this was something deliberate, something that had been erased for a reason. And that reason was the key to unlocking her true pain. I can help you find a way to live with it, Carter said, keeping his voice steady. I won't force you to remember anything you're not ready to face. But I can't let you keep running from it. You can't keep hiding from your own mind. She took in a shallow breath, her eyes darting to the door as if considering an escape. But something held her there, something deeper. Carter could sense it, she was both terrified and desperate. She wanted to run, but she also wanted to understand. To heal. Elena's expression softened, just slightly. It was a brief flicker, like a crack in a wall before it hardened again. You think you can fix me, she said softly, but there was a trace of bitterness in her voice now. But you don't know what's in there. You don't know what I've done. What I've chosen to forget. Carter leaned forward, trying to meet her gaze. I don't need to know all of it right now. I just need you to trust me. I know you're scared. But we can work through it together. You don't have to face everything all at once. Just take the first step with me. Let me help you. Her eyes locked onto his, a storm of emotions flickering behind them. There was pain, yes. But there was also a strange sense of surrender in her gaze, as if she was starting to understand that running wasn't an option anymore. "I don't want to be fixed," she whispered. "I just want to forget." For a moment, there was silence. Carter let the stillness fill the space between them, the weight of her words pressing down on him. It wasn't the first time he'd heard someone speak like this, but with Elena, it felt different. She wasn't just asking for escape, she was begging for it. "I can't let you erase yourself, Elena," Carter said quietly, his voice soft but resolute. "You can't hide from your past forever. You can't forget your way to healing. And you don't have to face everything today. But I need you to face something, anything, so we can begin. So we can take that first step together." There was a long pause. She didn't look at him right away. Instead, she seemed to be weighing something in her mind, as though the decision to trust him was something monumental, something she couldn't make lightly. Finally, her gaze shifted back to him, and this time, there was no avoiding the rawness in her eyes. "I don't know if I can," she said, her voice shaky, vulnerable. "But I don't know what else to do." Carter nodded, giving her a moment of quiet. "You don't have to know everything. I'm here, and I'll help you however you need." Her eyes stayed on him, searching, like she was trying to see through him, as though questioning whether he truly understood the weight of what he was offering. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke again, her voice trembling. "Okay. But, promise me something. Promise me that you won't change me. That whatever it is in there, you won't take it away." Carter's heart tightened at the request. He didn't know if he could promise that. He wasn't sure anyone could. But he didn't say that. Instead, he simply nodded. "I promise." And with that, he reached across the table, his hand resting lightly on hers. For a moment, the contact was enough. There was no magic, no immediate sense of resolution, but there was something there, an understanding. A bridge between the two of them that neither had anticipated. Carter closed his eyes, focusing inward, trying to center himself. The process would be difficult, and he knew it. Elena's trauma was buried deep, and he could feel the shadows of it all around her. The pain was raw, still fresh in her mind, even if it was something she'd chosen to forget. But he also knew that erasing memories wasn't the answer. It never had been. The answer was in healing. In facing what had been buried. He took a deep breath, extending his senses, ready to meet whatever lay beneath the surface. He wasn't just a doctor. He wasn't just a healer. He was the one who saw beyond the veil, the one who could feel the stories people had locked away. And he would face them. Whatever it took. As the session ended, Carter felt a heavy weight settle over him. He'd opened a door for Elena, one that she may not have been ready to face. But that was the nature of his work. The lines between healing and harm were never clear, not for him. Every life he touched, every person he healed, left a mark on him. And that mark, it was starting to feel permanent. The question that had been gnawing at him for weeks came back with force. Was he really helping them? Or was he just changing them? The next days blurred together for Carter. Patients came and went, each one more complicated than the last. There was the young mother who had survived an abusive marriage but couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't truly herself. The businessman who had everything yet was consumed by an unshakable fear of failure. The teenager with chronic headaches that no doctor could diagnose, only for Carter to find out that the pain was rooted in guilt for a mistake that no one else even knew about. Each time, Carter felt their pain, understood it on a level that most couldn't. Each time, he healed something. But with every success, something in him seemed to fray a little more. His sense of self, his identity, was slipping. The more people he healed, the more he could feel their emotions swirling inside him. He wasn't just helping them, he was becoming them, piece by piece. And as Elena's case continued to haunt him, Carter knew that the consequences of his abilities were growing ever more dangerous. If he wasn't careful, he might lose himself entirely in the memories of others, but there was no turning back now. There never had been. The world needed him. And as much as he had questioned his place in it, as much as he feared the personal cost, Carter knew one thing for certain: he was in too deep to stop. The following days were a blur, each one more grueling than the last, and yet each one seemed to stretch longer than the previous. Carter had taken to running through his patients with mechanical precision. It was easier that way, detached, systematic. The less he allowed himself to get involved, the less he felt the slow erosion of his own identity. Each person he healed left something behind. Each wound he closed in someone else seemed to open another inside him. Yet still, he kept going. The world needed him, and his abilities were more than just a gift, they were a responsibility, one he couldn't abandon no matter how much it hurt. And yet, as the days passed, the cracks started to show. There were moments when he'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, feeling the weight of someone else's nightmares pressing down on him. The memories of his patients, every face, every story, every painful confession, began to merge, their pain becoming his. Sometimes, he wasn't sure if the tears were his own or theirs. Sometimes, he couldn't tell where one person's sorrow ended and another's began. It was Elena's case, however, that kept him up at night. She lingered in his thoughts like a stubborn shadow. The promise he made to her, never to erase her pain, never to change her, felt like a weight on his chest. And yet, as much as he tried to keep his distance, his senses kept pulling him back toward her. She wasn't like his other patients. There was something different about her, something that unsettled him deeply. A week had passed since their first meeting. Elena hadn't returned to his office. And Carter hadn't tried to contact her. He knew better. Pushing her would only make things worse. But his curiosity gnawed at him. What had happened to her? What was she hiding so deeply that she couldn't even acknowledge it? He found himself driving to her apartment one evening, an impulsive decision that felt almost out of character. He told himself it was a simple check-in, a professional courtesy, nothing more. But as he stood outside her building, staring up at the darkened windows, he knew that wasn't the truth. He knocked on the door, his heart hammering in his chest as he waited. The apartment was silent. A soft light flickered from beneath the door, but there was no response. He knocked again, this time louder. A few moments passed before the door creaked open, and Elena appeared in the threshold, her face pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "Dr. Carter," she said, her voice hoarse as though she'd been crying. He took a breath, trying to steady himself. "Elena, come in," she interrupted, stepping aside to allow him into the apartment. There was something in her tone, something like resignation, that made his stomach tighten. The apartment was small, sparsely furnished, and quiet, save for the soft hum of a refrigerator in the corner. She gestured toward the couch, and Carter sat, but his eyes couldn't leave her. There was an emptiness in her expression, something that hadn't been there the last time they spoke. It was as though she had already retreated, burying herself deeper within. "I didn't expect you to come back," Elena said, her voice tinged with a mixture of bitterness and sadness. "But I suppose I'm glad you did. I've been thinking about what you said, about remembering." Carter opened his mouth to speak, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "I've made a decision," she continued, her gaze dropping to her hands in her lap. "I don't think I can do this, not with you. I don't want to remember. I don't want to open that door. It's too much. I don't know if I can live with it if I do." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had expected her to resist, of course, but not like this. She was breaking before his eyes, the very thing she was trying to forget coming undone with every word she spoke. Carter took a slow breath, the weight of his promise pressing down on him. "Elena, I can't promise you that it won't hurt," he said quietly. "But running from it won't fix anything. If we leave it buried, it'll consume you. And one day, you won't be able to outrun it. You're not just hiding from the memory. You're hiding from yourself. From the person you could be. But you don't have to face it all right now. I just need you to trust me. Let me help you, even if it's just a little." Elena's eyes flickered with emotion, and for a moment, it seemed as though she might break down right there. But instead, she closed her eyes, shaking her head as if trying to clear her thoughts. "I don't even know who I am anymore," she said softly. "I don't recognize myself. All I know is that whatever happened, I wanted to forget. I wanted it to be gone. I wanted to be someone else." Carter felt a sharp pang of sympathy, but there was something else, something more dangerous, lurking beneath her words. She was unraveling in front of him, and he knew that if he didn't act soon, she might slip through his fingers entirely. "Elena," he said, his voice low, "sometimes the pain you feel isn't just your own. Sometimes, it's a part of something bigger, something that's been shaped by others. But we can start to change that. We can start to rewrite it. Just a step at a time." She hesitated, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "I'm afraid of what I'll find if I start remembering." "I know," he said softly. "But you don't have to do it alone. I'm here with you." Elena looked up at him then, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "What if I don't want to remember at all? What if it's better to stay like this, lost? What if forgetting is the only way I can survive?" Carter shook his head gently, his gaze unwavering. "The only way to survive is to face it. To face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. You have the strength to do this, Elena. I know you do." There was a long silence. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Finally, Elena stood up, pacing back and forth across the small living room, her hands running through her hair in frustration. She stopped in front of him, her eyes hardening, her voice tight. "You don't understand, Dr. Carter," she said, her voice rising. "You think you can just fix people, that you can make them whole again, but you don't get it. I can't let you do that to me. I can't let you take that choice away from me." Carter stood up then, moving slowly toward her. "I'm not here to take anything from you," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to help you find the parts of yourself that you've lost. To help you heal, even if it's hard. But I can't do that unless you're willing to face it. I can't do it for you. All I can do is offer my help." Elena stared at him, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then, finally, she lowered her gaze, and her voice softened. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I'm scared of losing myself completely." Carter stepped forward, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You won't lose yourself, Elena. I promise. You'll find your way back to who you really are. I'll be here every step of the way." Her eyes met his, searching, questioning. Finally, she nodded, just slightly, as though giving in to something she hadn't fully understood. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's do it. But I don't know what will happen. I don't know if I can handle it." Carter nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. "We'll take it one step at a time." Carter stood there, his hand still lightly resting on Elena's shoulder, the weight of her decision hanging in the air. She had agreed, tentatively, hesitantly, but she had agreed. The door she had so desperately wanted to keep closed had cracked open just enough for him to step through. But as he stood there, watching the uncertain fear in her eyes, he knew this was only the beginning. He wasn't just about to heal her physical pain, he was about to confront something much darker, much deeper than he had ever encountered before. "Are you ready?" he asked softly, his voice gentle but steady, his heart pounding in his chest as though anticipating what would come next. The last time he had entered someone's mind, the experience had left scars on him. Elena was different, though. There was a kind of rawness to her, a disquiet that made him wonder if he was about to lose himself in her memories, too. Elena took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. For a moment, Carter could feel the weight of her indecision pressing against him like an invisible force. She wanted to be strong, to show him she was in control, but underneath it all, he could feel her fear, her desperation to hold on to the part of herself she thought she might lose. "I don't know what's going to happen," she said, her voice shaky. "But I'm ready to try." Carter nodded and stepped back, giving her space, but not leaving her side. He could feel the room growing heavier, as though the air itself was thickening, preparing for what was about to unfold. He had healed others by confronting their emotional wounds, by diving deep into their minds to bring the pain to the surface, but he had never been so unsure of what lay beneath. "Close your eyes," he said softly, "and just focus on your breath. Let your mind follow the rhythm of it, slow, deep, steady." She nodded and did as he instructed, her eyes closing as she began to breathe more deeply, more evenly. Carter felt his own pulse begin to slow, matching hers as he synchronized his energy with hers. The connection wasn't instantaneous, but it was strong. He could feel the beat of her heart, feel the thrum of her emotions, faint at first, but steadily growing louder the deeper he focused. There was something locked away in there, something that even she didn't understand. He reached out, extending his senses beyond the physical world, beyond the room they were in, into the intangible space of Elena's mind. At first, all he sensed was coldness, a hollow emptiness, as if a great void had swallowed everything she was. But then, like a whisper in the dark, something shifted. A faint memory surfaced, fragmented, jagged. A sense of dread crept through the cracks of her thoughts, and Carter could feel it, her fear, her confusion, her attempts to shut it all out. "Don't look, don't look. Don't open it again," the thought rushed through his mind, not in words, but in the overwhelming emotional resonance of it. She didn't want to remember, not just because of the pain, but because of what remembering might do to her. Carter knew the rules of his work, the limits he had set for himself. But this was different. This wasn't just healing. This was something more profound, and far more dangerous. He didn't back away. Instead, he focused deeper, pushing gently against the wall of her mind. He could feel the emotions she had buried, the raw, jagged edges of a trauma too painful to face. There were flashes, images, feelings, sounds, just out of reach, like shadows that danced on the edges of his perception. It was like trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. Suddenly, there was a shift, a crack in the wall she had so carefully built around herself. Carter felt it, felt her mind opening like a door that had been sealed shut for far too long. Her emotions flooded into him, guilt, regret, sorrow, and then, buried deeper still, an overwhelming sense of loss. He could feel the weight of it pressing against him, threatening to drag him down with it. He had to hold on. He couldn't let go. "Not yet, focus, Elena," he said softly, keeping his voice calm and steady, trying to anchor her to the present. "You don't have to face everything all at once. Just breathe. Stay with me." She nodded again, but her body was trembling now, as though she were teetering on the edge of something too vast and too dark to comprehend. Carter could sense her fighting it, trying to pull back, to close the door again. But it was too late. He was already inside. The memories came like a flood, too fast for him to catch them all. A man's voice, harsh, angry. A flash of pain, sharp and sudden. A door slamming. A face, twisted in anger, fading before he could see it clearly. Then, a single moment, a young woman, lying on the floor, blood pooling beneath her, her eyes wide with terror. Carter gasped, his breath caught in his throat. It was Elena, the woman in the memory. She had been there. She had seen it. She had caused it. "Please, no," Elena gasped, her voice barely a whisper, but Carter could feel the desperation in her, the urge to flee. I can't see this. I can't remember it." He pushed through it, forcing his focus on her. "You can, Elena. You can. You're strong. This isn't who you are anymore." But the images didn't stop. They kept coming, flashes of a life that Elena had tried so desperately to forget. A confrontation. A terrible mistake. A death. Carter felt the surge of panic rising in her chest, felt it threatening to consume her. It was too much. Too much for anyone to carry. He steadied himself, keeping her tethered to the present. "Elena, I need you to listen to me," he said, his voice firm, desperate. "This isn't who you are. The past doesn't define you. It doesn't have to. You've survived this. You're still here. That's who you are." But it was too late. The dam broke, and everything came rushing to the surface, her terror, her guilt, her shame. The burden of it crashed down on them both, overwhelming him as much as it was overwhelming her. Carter could feel her slipping away, losing herself in the flood of memories, and for a terrifying moment, he wasn't sure if she was going to come back. "Stay with me, Elena," he pleaded, his voice breaking through the chaos. "You are not this. You are more than this pain. You are not defined by this moment." The world seemed to shudder around them as the weight of her memories pressed in on both of them. But as the intensity of the emotions began to subside, Carter felt it, a subtle shift. Elena's breathing slowed, her pulse steadying. The images began to fade, replaced by a strange, quiet calm. Elena's eyes fluttered open, her expression dazed but clear. The walls in her mind, the ones she had so carefully constructed, were still there. But they were no longer as impenetrable as they had been. She took a shaky breath, her voice barely audible. I remember now." Carter sat back, his own heart pounding in his chest as he wiped the sweat from his brow. He had done it. They had done it. But he wasn't sure if the price of this victory would be worth it. Elena was still reeling from the memories she had unearthed, and Carter was left wondering if he had done the right thing. Was she truly healed? Or had he just opened a door that should have remained shut? He wasn't sure anymore. "Elena," he whispered, his voice soft as he reached for her hand. "You're not alone. Not anymore." She nodded, her fingers squeezing his, her expression still dazed but a flicker of something else in her eyes. Gratitude, maybe. Or perhaps something deeper, something that had been buried for too long, but Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him, too. The memories of his patients, of Elena's, were starting to bleed into his own thoughts. The lines between who he was and who they were beginning to blur. And for the first time, Carter wondered if he would ever be able to separate himself from the very people he was trying to help. Carter sat quietly beside Elena, the room still heavy with the silence that followed the storm of emotions. She wasn't looking at him, her eyes focused on some point in the distance, as though the weight of what had just happened was too much to bear all at once. The memories that had surged up within her, rushed out of their sealed vault, were still fresh, lingering in the air around them like smoke. It was as though she could almost taste it, feel it settling into her skin. He could see the strain on her face, the way her jaw tightened with every breath. He wasn't sure what to say. There was so much that had happened, so much that had been unleashed. Her memory had flooded back in fragments, too overwhelming to process immediately. The violence of the past, the guilt, and the shadows of a life she had tried to bury, all of it was still raw. But there was something else now. Something tentative, fragile, like the first rays of light breaking through a stormy sky. "You're okay," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if it was true. "It's over. You're here. You've survived." She didn't answer, but she didn't pull away either. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of what they had both experienced. Carter's mind was still whirling. He had brought her to this moment, this precipice where the past had poured out of her like a flood. He wasn't sure if he had done the right thing. Sometimes, he questioned whether anyone could really be healed by confronting such dark, painful memories. There was always a risk, a chance that opening the wound would only deepen it, that the scars would never fade. He had always believed in the power of healing, the ability to fix what was broken. But with Elena, he wasn't sure anymore. Could he really help her move past the darkness? Could anyone truly be freed from the things they tried so hard to forget? Or was he merely reshaping their pain, putting it into a new box with different edges? I need to know what happened, Elena said suddenly, her voice low, hoarse. She turned to face him now, her eyes wide and searching, as if she needed to understand what had just been unlocked. I don't know what's real anymore. Carter nodded slowly, watching her. You don't have to face it all right now. But when you're ready, we can talk about it. You've already faced more than most people could ever imagine. You can face the rest of it, too. She shook her head, her eyes filled with an almost desperate confusion. I don't know if I can. I don't know if I even want to. It's too much. It's too big. Her words pierced him, reminding him of something he had known from the start. Some pain was too vast to contain. Some grief wasn't something you could simply fix. You couldn't heal every wound, and in that moment, Carter realized something he had never truly allowed himself to confront before. The burden of this gift, this curse, was that he couldn't save everyone. Not really. He could ease the pain, but sometimes the pain wasn't just something to be fixed. It was part of who they were. And to erase it might destroy the very essence of them. He took a deep breath, looking at Elena with a mixture of sympathy and quiet understanding. He had known, deep down, that he was always walking a fine line. But now it felt sharper than ever. If he wasn't careful, if he pushed too hard, he might lose her in a way that was irreversible. It wasn't about healing. Not always. Sometimes, it was about allowing the wounds to exist without trying to erase them completely. You're right, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe you don't need to remember everything. Maybe you just need to find a way to live with it. I'm not here to force you to relive it. I'm here to help you move forward. But you have to decide how much you're ready to face. Elena took in a shaky breath, her eyes wet with unshed tears. The vulnerability in her gaze made something in his chest tighten. I don't know who I am anymore, she whispered. I've spent so long running from it, pretending it never happened. But now it's all come rushing back, and I feel like I'm drowning in it. Like I've lost myself. Carter reached for her hand, a silent reassurance. You haven't lost yourself, Elena. You're still here. And that's the most important thing. The rest of it can come in time. You don't have to figure it all out today. She nodded, but there was a faraway look in her eyes now, as if she were searching for something she wasn't sure she'd find. Her fingers tightened around his, and for a moment, there was silence between them again, the kind of silence that held 1,000 unsaid words. Carter sat back in the chair, running a hand through his hair, trying to settle his own thoughts. The weight of what had happened was still pressing down on him, too heavy to ignore. The connection he had felt with Elena had been deeper than with any other patient. There was something about her past, her pain, that had struck a chord inside him. That he had known, from the moment he began this line of work, that his gift came with a price. He felt the emotional weight of others, the things they couldn't say, the pain they couldn't articulate. But the more he helped, the more entangled he became in their lives, their feelings, their histories. He was walking a dangerous line now, and he knew it. If he wasn't careful, he might lose himself completely. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city, the lights twinkling like distant stars. But it wasn't the city he was looking at. It was the faces of all the people he had helped, the faces of those who had left pieces of themselves behind in his mind. He had saved them, hadn't he? Or had he only changed them? Had he erased parts of them they couldn't afford to lose? Carter didn't have the answers. But he knew one thing for certain: if he kept walking down this path, there would be no coming back. He would never be the same. His identity, his sense of self, would blur beyond recognition. He turned back to Elena, who had stayed seated, still lost in her own thoughts. We don't have to do this alone, he said softly. I'm here for you, Elena. Every step of the way. You're not alone in this. Her eyes met his, filled with gratitude and something else, something he couldn't quite name. For a moment it was enough, but as he left her apartment that evening, stepping back into the cool night air, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, not just in her, but in himself. He had seen the limits of his abilities, the weight of the choices he had made. There was a price to healing, and sooner or later, it would be his turn to pay it, and when that moment came, he wasn't sure who he would be, but one thing was clear: his work was far from over. And neither was the cost. The days that followed were strange, as if the world outside had lost its sharp edges and blurred into something soft and muted. Carter went through his routines, saw patients, helped them as best as he could, but everything felt distant. His connection to their pain, which had once been so sharp, now felt like a dull ache, like he was observing someone else's suffering from the outside. Each time he healed, each time he pushed someone's grief to the surface, a part of him seemed to fragment a little more. He wasn't just carrying the burdens of the people he helped, he was becoming them, and yet, there was a strange sense of satisfaction in knowing that, for a brief moment, he had managed to help. The pain was never truly gone, never truly erased, but it was quieted. At least for now. But it was Elena's case that lingered in his mind, her face haunting him in his moments of silence. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, not just in her, but in himself. The memories that had come flooding back in her mind had stayed with him too. The guilt, the pain, the unspoken things that had been buried. He had felt it all, and now it was part of him. He couldn't forget it. And worse, he didn't know if he wanted to. Because the more he felt their suffering, the more he began to understand them, to see the world through their eyes. It was intoxicating, this power, this ability to touch someone's soul and understand them completely. But it was also terrifying. The more he helped, the more he lost of himself. One evening, after finishing a late session with a patient, Carter found himself unable to sleep. His mind raced with the faces of his patients, the fragments of their lives and stories swimming in his head, pushing and pulling at him like waves in a storm. He got up, walked to the window, and stared out at the city below. The streets were quiet now, the usual buzz of traffic replaced by the distant hum of the night. For a brief moment, he wished he could shut it all out, turn it off like a switch and forget. But he couldn't. It was in his bones now. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Eva, his assistant. "There's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent. I told her you were done for the night, but she's insistent." He stared at the message for a moment, then sighed and typed a quick reply: "Send her in." A few minutes later, the door to his office opened, and Elena stepped inside, her eyes red-rimmed, her face pale. She was wearing the same clothes she'd had on the day he last saw her, as though she hadn't left her apartment in days. Something about her presence in his office, the way she looked at him, sent a chill through him. It was as if she was no longer the person he had helped only days before. Something had changed, and he could feel it. "Elena," Carter said softly, standing up from his chair. "What's wrong? What happened?" She didn't answer right away. She simply stood there, her hands clutched tightly in front of her, her breath shallow. Her gaze flickered around the room, like she wasn't entirely sure where to look. He could feel the weight of her emotions pressing down on him, and he didn't have to ask to know that she was carrying something that she couldn't bear alone. Elena's voice cracked, and she stopped, taking a deep breath. "I need your help again, Dr. Carter. But I'm not sure if you can help me this time." Carter's heart quickened, a knot forming in his stomach. "Tell me what's going on." I don't know what's real anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I've remembered, everything I thought I understood. It's slipping away. The more I try to hold on to it, the more it falls apart." Carter took a step closer to her, his instincts flaring. This wasn't just another memory to fix. He could see it in her eyes, feel it in the air around them. There was something deeper at play here, something that went beyond just healing. It was something he hadn't considered before, not with Elena. Is it the memories? The things we uncovered? He asked, his voice gentle but edged with concern. Do you want me to help you remember again? She shook her head, her eyes wild now, searching for something in him. No. It's not that. It's like I'm losing myself. I can't separate what's mine and what's someone else's anymore. It's like the memories aren't even mine to begin with. They feel borrowed. The word hung in the air, its weight pressing down on him. Borrowed, he repeated, confused. What do you mean? Elena's breath hitched, and she suddenly collapsed into the chair near his desk, her body trembling with the force of it. When I remember those things, those moments, the more I try to piece them together, the more I realize that they don't belong to me. They're not just my past. They're someone else's too. And it's not just the memories, it's the feelings. I can't shake them, Carter. I can't separate them from my own. I'm becoming someone else. The realization hit him like a lightning bolt. He'd known, in the back of his mind, that his ability to dive into someone else's emotions, their past, their pain, was a dangerous thing. But he had never considered that it might not just be the memories that were tangled up in him, that they might actually be blending into his own life. You're saying that the memories I helped you uncover, they aren't just yours, Carter said slowly, piecing it together. That the emotions attached to them, they belong to someone else? She nodded, her eyes wide with panic. I think it's his. I think it's his emotions. The man from my past, the one who hurt me. His pain, his anger, it's in me. It's like I'm living his memories now, Carter. I feel like I'm becoming him. Carter felt the blood drain from his face. She wasn't just reliving the trauma. She wasn't just remembering it. She was absorbing it, becoming it. She was beginning to lose herself in the very memories he had helped unlock. And as much as he wanted to deny it, he knew she was right. He had been the one to open the door to that pain, to that darkness. Elena, he whispered, a sense of dread creeping up his spine. What are you saying? I don't know how to stop it, she said, her voice shaking now. Every time I try to let go, it pulls me back in. I can't separate myself from him. I can't separate myself from what happened. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. Carter didn't know what to do. He had crossed a line with her, a line he hadn't even known existed. He had meant to help her heal. But now, he wasn't so sure that he hadn't just made things worse. Elena, I never meant for this to happen, he said, his voice tight with regret. I didn't know this would happen. But I can help you. I can help you sort this out. We can. No, she interrupted, cutting him off, her eyes fierce now. You don't understand. I can't just erase this. I can't undo what you've done. I've been feeling it, his emotions, his pain, his anger, and now I'm scared. I'm scared I'll become him. I don't know who I am anymore, Carter. I don't know what's left of me. Carter stood frozen, his mind racing. He had never felt so helpless. He had prided himself on being able to heal, to fix, to help people. But Elena was beyond his abilities now. He had opened a door he didn't know how to close. And if he couldn't figure out how to fix this, if he couldn't separate her from the pain he had brought to the surface, he might lose her completely. I'm sorry, he said softly, his voice breaking. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought I was helping you, but I didn't understand. Elena's face softened, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. I know you didn't. But now I don't know what to do. Neither of them said anything for a long time. They were both trapped in the aftermath of what had happened, unable to go back, unable to move forward. Carter finally broke the silence. I won't give up on you. I swear I won't. We'll figure this out. But we have to do it together. Elena nodded, her shoulders slumping. I don't know how. But I'll try. The silence in the room stretched on, thick and oppressive, as if the air itself had absorbed the weight of everything Elena had just revealed. Carter stood there, feeling more helpless than he ever had before. He'd helped countless people, but this felt like something beyond him, beyond anything he'd ever encountered. Elena wasn't just struggling with the aftermath of her trauma. She was entangled in someone else's pain, someone else's memories. She was losing herself, and he was the one who had opened that door. I need you to focus, Carter said quietly, trying to steady his own breath, trying to push away the panic that had begun to stir in him. Focus on you. The real you. Not the memories, not the emotions. Just you. Elena's face twisted in frustration. I've tried, Carter. I've tried to pull myself out of it, but every time I do, it's like I'm swallowed whole again. His anger, his guilt. I feel it in my chest, it makes my hands shake. I'm becoming him. Her voice cracked as the last words left her mouth, and Carter could feel the depth of her fear, her desperate need to hold on to herself, to stop whatever was happening. But she wasn't sure if she could. And neither was he. You're not becoming him, Carter said firmly, his voice filled with an intensity he hadn't expected. He stepped closer, his gaze locking onto hers, his hand instinctively reaching for hers. Elena, you are you. What's happening right now, it's temporary. It's not you. You don't have to become him. She closed her eyes briefly, shaking her head, but then met his gaze again, the exhaustion and terror in her expression too much for him to ignore. You don't get it. Every time I close my eyes, it's his face I see. When I breathe, it's his breath I feel. I don't know how to stop it, Carter. I don't know how to come back to myself. Carter felt something in his chest tighten at the rawness in her voice. He had always been able to fix things, always had a solution, but this? This wasn't something he could fix with a simple touch or diagnosis. This was more complex, more dangerous. She wasn't just dealing with her trauma, she was dealing with the ghost of someone else's pain that had been unintentionally grafted into her soul. He had been the one to draw it out, and now it was threatening to consume her. I can't leave you like this, Carter said, his voice quieter, softer now. I won't. Elena's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and her voice came out in a whisper. I don't know how to get back, Carter. I don't know if there's a way back for me. I'm going to help you, he said, more to himself than to her. But he didn't know how. He had to believe that there was a way to fix this, to separate Elena from the pain she was feeling, to return her to herself. He took a breath, drawing on the calm he had worked so hard to cultivate, trying to quiet the storm inside him. He couldn't give in to panic, not now. If he lost his focus, if he allowed the weight of the situation to overwhelm him, he would lose everything he had fought so hard to build with Elena. He had to remain steady, for both of them. I need you to trust me, Carter said gently, his voice calm and measured. I'm going to help you, but you need to let me guide you. Let me help you focus on who you are, who you were before all of this. And we're going to do it together. Elena nodded hesitantly, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes, just enough to keep him going. Carter had learned over the years that healing wasn't just about fixing someone's body or mind, it was about meeting them where they were, being there for them in a way that allowed them to open up, to trust, and to take that first step toward freedom. He wasn't just her doctor anymore. He was the one who had brought her back to life in a way, and now, he had to help her hold on to that life. Close your eyes again, Carter instructed softly. Breathe with me. Slow. Steady. In and out. Focus on the sound of your breath. That's you. That's your breath. Nothing else. He could feel her breath starting to slow, matching his own, the tension in her shoulders easing just a little. But even as she breathed deeply, Carter could feel the remnants of something else lingering, her fear, her connection to something that wasn't hers, clinging to her like a shadow. Elena, Carter continued, his voice low but strong. You've been through so much. But you're here. You've survived. You're not who you were then, and you're not who you think you're becoming now. What you're feeling, that anger, that guilt, it's his, not yours. It's not who you are. You can let go of it. Her body trembled slightly, but she nodded, her eyes still closed. He could feel her resistance, her fear of losing control again. He knew she was still grappling with the overwhelming weight of the memories that had been unearthed, and the pain they carried. But Carter wasn't going to let her slip away. Not now. Not when she had already come this far. You are not him, Carter said again, more forcefully this time. You're not the man who hurt you. You're the woman who survived. You are Elena, and nothing can change that. There was a long silence. Carter held his breath, waiting for her to respond, to accept what he was saying, to let the words sink in. Finally, Elena exhaled, a shaky breath that seemed to carry all the weight of the past few days. She opened her eyes slowly, looking at him with a quiet intensity. I want to believe that. I want to believe you. Carter's heart clenched in his chest. Then believe it. You're not alone in this. Not anymore. She nodded again, the tension in her face starting to ease. It wasn't over. He knew that. But they had made progress. The connection she felt to the man who had haunted her for so long had started to loosen. The grip wasn't as tight as it had been. And in that small shift, there was hope. He stood up slowly, his hand still on hers, as if grounding them both in this moment. We'll keep working through this, one step at a time. I won't leave you, Elena. I promise. For the first time in days, Elena managed a weak, but genuine smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I believe you, she whispered. Carter nodded, a small but sincere smile tugging at his lips. He didn't know how long it would take to truly heal, to separate Elena from the pain that wasn't hers to carry, but he knew one thing: they weren't done yet. And as long as she was willing to fight, he would be there. He would help her, but deep down, Carter knew that this journey wasn't just about healing Elena. It was about him too. He had to find a way to separate himself from their pain, to remain who he was in the midst of it all. He had saved Elena once. Now, he had to save himself. The next few days passed slowly, like the world was holding its breath. Elena had become quieter, more withdrawn, but there was a certain stillness about her now, a softness that hadn't been there before. She came to see Carter every few days, each session leaving her more grounded, though there was still a heaviness in her gaze. Every time she left his office, she seemed a little bit lighter, as though a burden she'd carried for so long was slowly being chipped away. It wasn't fast, it wasn't clean, but it was progress. And for the first time in weeks, Carter allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope, but there was something else creeping in the back of his mind, the growing realization that Elena was only one part of the equation. He was still carrying the weight of his own decisions, still trying to figure out if he was really helping or if he was simply getting lost in other people's pain. Each time he reached into someone's mind, felt their fears, their regrets, their emotions, it left a mark on him. And he could feel it now more than ever. He had never stopped to consider the toll it was taking. The more he dived into the depths of his patient's suffering, the less he was sure of who he was. It wasn't just empathy anymore, it was something deeper, something that was beginning to erase the boundaries of his own identity. He had helped so many people, but at what cost? It was a question that gnawed at him, especially when he was alone in his office late at night, staring out at the city that seemed so distant from him now. His phone buzzed suddenly, breaking the silence. He glanced down at the screen. Eva, there's a patient here for you. It's urgent. You should come quickly. The urgency in her message tugged at him. There were always emergencies, always someone in need, but tonight, something about the message felt different. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door. When he arrived at his office, Eva was waiting for him in the hallway, her expression tight with concern. It's one of your regulars, she said, her voice low. "A man named James Holt. He's been asking for you for a while, but now, he's demanding to see you immediately. He won't talk to anyone else." Carter didn't have time to ask questions. He nodded and followed Eva to the room where Holt was waiting. As soon as he stepped inside, he saw the man sitting there, hunched over with his hands clenched in his lap. Holt was a tall man, broad-shouldered, the kind who appeared physically intimidating, but Carter could sense the vulnerability underneath. Holt was one of the patients who had come to him when he was first starting out. The kind of person who didn't quite know what they were looking for, but knew they couldn't keep going the way they were. "Mr. Holt," Carter said gently, his voice calm as he walked over to the chair across from him. "What's going on?" Holt didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the floor, his jaw working as if he was trying to find the right words. Carter waited, patient, letting him gather himself. Finally, Holt's voice broke the silence. "I'm losing my mind, Doc," he said, his voice rough, raw with emotion. "I don't know what's happening to me, but I can't sleep, I can't think straight. I keep hearing things. Seeing things. I don't know who I am anymore." Carter's heart sank. This wasn't the usual anxiety or stress that Holt had dealt with in the past. Something was different. "What kind of things?" Carter asked carefully. Holt looked up, his eyes wide with fear. "Voices," he whispered. "I hear them all the time, whispering. Telling me to do things. Bad things. And sometimes I don't know if it's me or them. It's like I'm losing control. I can feel it slipping away." The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker, as Carter's mind raced to catch up. Voices. Loss of control. Holt wasn't just dealing with the kind of stress that had plagued him before. This was something deeper, darker. Carter felt the familiar tug of empathy, the sensation of reaching into someone's mind to understand their pain, to feel their confusion and terror. But something about it felt off. It was more than just fear. It was something invasive, something that had burrowed deep into Holt's psyche. And Carter could feel it too now, creeping into his own thoughts, mixing with his own emotions. "I can't hear them anymore, not as clearly," Holt continued, his voice trembling. "But I still feel them. It's like they're in my head. All the time. And I don't know how to get them out." Carter stood there, listening, but a growing sense of unease was building inside him. This wasn't just a typical case of anxiety or trauma. Holt wasn't just experiencing the aftereffects of his past. It was as if something else had taken root in him, something that was feeding off his fear, his uncertainty, growing stronger with every moment. "Elena," Carter thought to himself, but he pushed the thought away. He couldn't make the connection yet. But the pattern was starting to form in the back of his mind, a terrifying connection between Holt's symptoms and what he had seen in Elena's case. "Mr. Holt," Carter said, his voice firm, trying to center himself. "This is serious. I need to understand more about what's happening to you. Has anything happened recently that might have triggered these experiences? Any changes, any events?" Holt hesitated, his eyes darting around as if searching for the right words. There's been something. I haven't told anyone about it, not even you." He took a shaky breath, and Carter could see the hesitation, the deep conflict in his expression. I did something. A long time ago. Something I thought I'd forgotten." Carter could feel the tension in the room shift, the air growing thick with the weight of the unsaid. "What was it?" Carter asked, his voice steady despite the growing knot in his stomach. Holt looked up, meeting Carter's gaze, and for the first time, there was a flicker of recognition. A realization. I think I made a choice. A choice to forget. To bury it." Carter's heart stopped for a moment as he understood exactly what Holt was saying. The pattern. The voices. The memories. Holt, like Elena, had buried something so deep that it was now trying to claw its way back. But this wasn't just a case of repressed memories. It was as if Holt's very identity was being invaded by something that had been hidden for far too long. And whatever it was coming for him. Holt, Carter said, his voice lower now, quieter. You need to tell me everything. Every detail. Whatever it is you buried. It's the only way to stop this. But as Holt opened his mouth to speak, Carter felt something shift in the room, something dark and heavy pressing against him. He wasn't sure if it was Holt's fear or something else. But it was all-consuming, and suddenly, Carter wasn't sure if the memories Holt was about to reveal would change him too. He had crossed a line with Elena. And now, it seemed, the line was starting to blur with Holt and there was no going back.